This next assignment is going to take what you've learned in your limited palette field painting and turn it on something real. Now you've sort of explored many colors in the abstraction, but now we're going to focus on something that's real, and therefore there's going to be a little bit more constraint, a little bit more focus on trying to achieve what you're viewing in the subject. And for the subjects, I think there are many options, but I think given the time of year, given the season, choose produce that's available that interests you. Natural forms that are singular objects that you can focus on to develop realistic color, or close to realistic color, with the limited palette you've been using. And to remind you, as you're starting this, the format, the canvas you'll be using will be the one of your 11 by 14 inch canvases, not the 16 by 20s, but one of the 11 by 14. And you don't have to, you shouldn't really tape off the edges. This was a piece of unstretched canvas that was larger than that. But you still get the same objectives and the same procedure when you're looking at this butternut squash. Now it's a kind of color, its basic color is a sort of fleshy, close to, or shall we say, described as orange, pinkish orange, fleshy orange type color. And just as you achieved identifiable colors in your field of abstract limited palette, you are able to get colors that are closer, not exact, and sometimes it's going to be a stretch, but you're going to get colors that approach the real object because you're dealing with the complements of those colors. Just a refresher here on your complements. You're talking about blue and orange, red and green, yellow and purple. Those are colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel, and they, when mixed together, kill each other, make them very neutral. But when they're juxtaposed, when we talked about, especially with your fields, when you put a red alongside a green, you're reinforcing them almost like a graphic Christmas card. So in this one, we are trying to get a kind of warm, fleshy, perhaps identified as orange color. And the best way to do that was the invention of this student's piece of paper or cloth underneath, which was probably not that color, but became a blue. So you're making up, you are inventing very often the environment, the space, the paper that it's on, the tabletop that it's on, in terms of its color, so it reinforces the color of the object you're painting. So in this winter squash, you can see that the green of the vegetable itself is reinforced, gets more identifiably green, because it's surrounded by a made-up environment of various values and intensities of red. So along with the basic color of the object, which is reinforced by the complement around it, there's still the matter of the three-dimensionality, the reality, the thing that is real with illumination and shadow. So a couple of words about highlights and shadows. Generally, we tend to think of highlights as being just white plus the color, and shadows, perhaps, if you're just starting out, as why not black in the color? Well, although we've got a Payne's gray that's close to black, it is a cool Payne's gray, and therefore when you begin to add it to the color that is the base color of the object, it not only darkens it very quickly, but it also tends to cool it. Okay, so you end up with a shadow being dark and cool. There's also a footnote of it being neutral, but we don't have to worry about neutrals with this limited palette. So dark and cool with the Payne's gray in the base color of the object. Turn around to the side that's being illuminated, that's being bathed with light, you end up with, yes, white added to that base color, that basic color of the object. But also with that white, I would make sure that in most cases, if not in all cases, that the highlight be warm, that you add a little bit of a warm color, perhaps most likely a yellow, to that reflective, strong edge that is illuminated in light. Now this one, compared to the butternut squash, which was the first image, it's much more complex. It's got these striations of pale yellow. It's got the warm light neutral of the stem. It's more detailed. It is your choice, with your experience, with your ambition, with your ability to invest a lot of work. You can get as complex or as simple as you wish. I mean, I'm really obviously appreciative of the detail and the reality of this thing here, but there's a quality to this, to the simple, minimal, in the best sense, strong, broad brushstroke of that first butternut squash versus this one. So you determine what point you want to jump in terms of complexity and detail. I would probably recommend that that you not jump to objects that have too much detail or striations of too much color. In other words, especially when that color might be complex and sort of blended and almost airbrushed across the object, like a multicolored apple, something that's green and red and yellow and orange at the same time. So just keep to the object you feel you can handle, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, because what's more important in this is that you get the idea of how simple or complex objects move from light to dark, and how the limited palette can be used to make color that would seem to be surprisingly impossible when you stare at the palette. So with these, which I believe are onions, you have a kind of in-between attitude between the butternut squash and its simplicity and sort of sculptural volume, and the winter squash, which was, you know, beautifully detailed and sort of incredibly defined. Here you've got some color and some detail, but it's put in a much more fresh and sort of painterly way, as we say in the art world. Painterly simply means a kind of free brush stroke, a kind of energetic brush stroke, and especially in the background, especially in the made-up colors that are surrounding these things, you see a liveliness and an action with the paint itself. And here, with what turns out to be a lime, you've got an obvious complementary pair with that piece of paper that's red and the green of the lime itself. And I think the simplicity with which this is done, the sort of general brushstrokes with which this is painted, you know, relates more to that butternut squash, but to its credit, a much more lively color, the green versus the red. Now the precision in this one is spectacular. I don't have to repeat what the complementary relationships are, but what I really admire in this one is the complexity of the cast shadow. The cast shadow is the shadow that is on the tabletop that is being sort of thrown out by the object blocking the space. Now that's spectacular because it seems to be like a concentric darkness versus lightness, with the lightness being on the outside. However, when you come to the highlights in this one, yes, they're well seen. Yes, they're well painted in terms of their shape and their value, their very lightness, but they're a little bit chalky. They're a little bit flat because they did not perhaps follow the suggestion of using just a bit of a warm color in there. You would end up with things that would look much more on the surface of the apple itself if you were to have put just a touch of your limited palette yellow ochre along with a lot of that white. So the good news is, as scary as this seems and as complex as this seems, you're not required. I'm not requiring you to do this, but I do want you to take you on a tour of what this very regular and proportionally accurate grid of just your four limited palette colors can achieve with a variety of colors. There's a kind of progression from color up top to white, and then color in the middle, down to the Payne's Gray, darker, cooler black, and you can see the universe of hues and hue qualities that you can get with just the limited palette. So now let's take a look at some examples of things you might be able to paint, and the kinds of color choices and color invention that you would do to make them their appropriate color. I'm tempted to say that I spent a month or so training this eggplant to stand up straight, but evidently it just had a flat bottom, so it's not an unnatural thing that's happening here. So this is a not terribly identifiably colorful thing, but it nonetheless has a kind of dark, probably Payne's Gray purple, blue purple, for most of its color. And there is a nuance of color, especially in the stem up top, where I can see something close to yellow, pale yellow, and greens, and the darker, sort of cooler shadow off to the left. Now, even though this is staged in a kind of tabletop and backdrop, you are welcome to, in fact, you have to change those colors into the colors that would enhance the color quality of the subject itself. Here you're not really stretching to make an identifiable color, but it should still be in something as subtle, a blue, black, purple body of the eggplant. So with this pumpkin here, even though you have a sort of gray-blue background, you're going to emphasize that blue-gray, perhaps all over the environment that you have here. I do see that the shadow, which is nice and contrasted and dark, although it doesn't go to blue because it's a warm surface, it does go to a kind of neutral, almost cool shadow, because what you're really doing is mixing a kind of cool color with the orange of the pumpkin itself. And note with the cast shadows, I mentioned this quickly in one of the other images, but very often with cast shadows, as with your achromatic stills, you end up with a kind of concentric and ever lightening shadow on the outside of a shadow. It depends on the number of light sources you have. So watch out for cast shadows as being, mixed with the invented color that you're going to have for its tabletop. And here's a perfect example of how the highlight, which is sort of upper right, reflected on the pumpkin, is very much so a yellow-white. Yes, it's an orange pumpkin, but its highlight reflection becomes a kind of mixture of, yes, the pumpkin color, a lot of white, and maybe a little bit more yellow than you would think. It's another orange object, clementine. Again, you'd work with blues in the background. There's a bit of a harsh and sort of defined reflection that's a little less yellow than the other one, but still is fairly warm. The shadows there get to a kind of neutral, which implies a kind of bluish color mixed with the orange. There's the double-ringed cast shadow that we talked about in the last one. And because what we've shown so far are kind of relentlessly centered pieces, I do want to say that you have the option. In fact, I would encourage it to be a little asymmetrical, even though you've got one singular object. When you take into account the cast shadow, you've got the opportunity to use this other abstract shape, the cast shadow, to perhaps, in this case, maybe jog the clementine off to the right, move it up in the surface of the table a little bit. It's up to you, but you're not, although the primary objective of this is indeed to get the color as close as possible, as impossible as that can be. I do want to mention that even though you're stuck with one, or many of you are going to be stuck with one object, there is the opportunity to sort of shift it around and to consider the cast shadow as part of the construction of the composition. what comes to mind in viewing this particular photograph, it's obviously an intense yellow lemon, is that you can use photographs themselves as a kind of starting point. There's no reason why you can't set something up, get the lighting just right. And I know how many of you, if not all of you, are challenged in keeping a kind of space that is a workshop, that is a work area or studio, from being interrupted. So I have no problem, especially with these color exercises, for you to take a phone camera image and work from that if you're satisfied with the way the colors are laid out. Now the lucky thing about this lemon in this photograph is that you can see how it becomes the starting point for an evolved painting in the limited palette. So this person has positioned the photograph in close proximity to the canvas, and again I emphasize that you're using the 11 by, this might not be the precise dimensions of the canvas, but use your 11 by 14, the smaller canvas, for this particular exercise. So you've got a photo up top or close by. You've got the canvas in some kind of not near vertical. If you can do it, fine, but try to get it at a slight angle to the photograph that you're observing. Draw with your pencil whatever composition you want, and unlike this particular person, I would also draw in, as you're starting out, a cast shadow, because that becomes a significant part of the composition. And you've got with this one that horizontal line, which you could ignore if you want. The important thing is what color you use in the background, but it's sometimes an interesting compositional element if you can put in that imaginary tabletop or horizontal line that is an edge to space. So with this particular kind of limited palette painting, you want to first get a general color that would be called the base color, the color of the object without too much highlight and shadow. And then if you get that correctly, or if you get that close to the actual color you're seeing, somewhere in the neighborhood, you can then first begin to mix it with the Payne's gray in the shadows, and where it gets darker and maybe a little bit more neutral, and perhaps in the end a lot cooler, and then mix it as you begin to build up the shadows. Move towards also the highlight, which would simply be the basic color, the base color mixed with white. Here you really get a look at what happens when you begin to mix the Payne's gray with that yellow. It becomes a kind of green, not precisely what's in the photograph, but a darker and cooler version of it, and you're beginning to move out to the highlights, which are going to be lighter. And while you're modeling the lights and darks, before too long, certainly long before you're finished, you want to put in some background color, background spaces. And since I've bludgeoned you to death with what the complements are, you know that the yellow has the complement of purple. So as best as you can get a purple with the limited palette, this person has put in a darker purple in the background and a lighter one at the bottom that doesn't have to hold through the whole painting. But it is the reality that the closer value the complements are, the more they tend to interact. So I've got a feeling that in time that purple in the background is going to be made a bit lighter. So here are mixed colors on the palette. They obviously become, with the yellow and the Payne's gray, both the base color and the shadows that are going to darken the lemon at the bottom. Okay, this person is starting out with the purples now, which are going to be the background. And although you're not going to get a brilliant purple to begin with, the darker purples look like they're rich, and as they get mixed with the white, they will become closer to the value of the lemon itself, so that you end up with, as I've talked before, with two complementary colors that are a little bit close. Don't have to be exact, but they're a little bit closer in value, and therefore you end up with the optical visual phenomenon of making the complements much more bright. Here would be the final rendering of the lemon, and although the background doesn't scream purple, those neutral colors were developed from a purple mixture. So even though they are not intense purple, they're still radiating the complementary interaction with the yellow. And maybe a double whammy because the very fact that they are neutral versions of that purple contrast with the more intense color in the highlights and on top of the lemon itself. Nice brush strokes in the shadows of the lemon, and that really brings to mind the reality that you don't have to airbrush it if you're really caring about detail and want a kind of photographically perfect thing, with a kind of misted but not too watery blending. You can get that, but I prefer, well, shall I say it, I'm really drawn to the idea that the brush stroke can sort of sculpt and define and give direction to the shape of the lemon, and I sort of like seeing the actual brush strokes on the surface of the lemon. Note again the cast shadow, which has a little bit of complexity with a ring of lighter shadow around it, and most beautiful, I think, in this particular rendering is the scale and the delicate quality, the sensitivity of that cluster of white yellow that becomes the highly reflected part of the lemon. So I promise that this is indeed the last painting that you'll be using these limited palette colors. But the point of the whole exercise, both the abstraction and the realism, is that you're looking at nuances, you're looking at subtleties, and you're looking at basic color dynamics in a more subtle way. And I promise that indeed the next assignment is going to be a full color painting. It will be abstract and hard edge. We'll talk about that later. But you'll be able to choose, pick, mix, and design a full contingency of your personal colors.